And I'm just so amazed to be here because I'm an accidental author. I love that this whole Humanities Festival theme is journeys, because this was an amazing journey for me on many levels. And oddly enough, when I conceived of the book, I conceived of it in the form of a journey. And the chapters are laid out as a life's journey, both metaphorically a life's journey from birth to death, but a geographical journey that starts rather biblically with the flight out of Russia because of the Russian Revolution, and comes full circle at the end in a very unexpected way. And it was truly unexpected because when I started making this book, I really didn't know what I was doing. In every sense, I did not know how to make a book because I'd never made a book before, and I had never seen a book quite like the book I intended to make. I'd seen, biographies which had sleeves of photos in the middle, but I'd never seen a book that told a life's journey with images all through the book that were tied into the stories. You read a story, you saw the image. You saw an image, there was a story that went with it. I had not really seen a book like that before. And I also I conceived of the book as a journey, but I didn't know where I was going. I didn't have a map. I knew that it was going to end somewhere, but I didn't really know where, because I kind of made up how I told the story as it unfolded, page by page. So I had chapter headings to divide all the photographs up into units which could be understood and about which stories could be told. But I didn't really know the story I was telling. I was sitting by the campfire and it was kind of happening of its own. And the beauty of it was that somewhere I was being given permission because it all kind of fell into place. The way it started was, my mother lived in Australia the last 8 years of her life, in the most beautiful place that was also very humid, kind of subtropical. And she lived near my sister there. And after my mother died, all her papers, my sister said, needed sorting through and deciding what to do with, but she was concerned because of the climate, because of the humidity. Everything gets moldy if you don't take care of it. And my sister was not emotionally ready to be sorting through the stuff. So I said, well, I live in Los Angeles, I live in a desert, send it to me. So a few weeks later, a UPS van sort of drew up, and these huge boxes showed up. I mean, they were almost as tall as me. They were like moving boxes. I thought, my God, I didn't know there was that much stuff. And then I opened the boxes in the hallway, and they're full of plastic shopping bags and trash bags. And there are some albums and posters and scrapbooks, but most of the shopping bags appear to be full of photographs and letters, just higgledy-piggledy like that. Oh my God. So I, one at a time, I lug these plastic bags up to the little room next to my bedroom that is my little office, and I tip it all out on the floor, and there is this mountain. There turned out to be about 2,000 photographs that went from 1915 to 2008, and correspondence going back to 1926. And I had been talking to the curator of the New York Public Library Dance Division about them taking my mother's papers, which fitted beautifully into the Ballet Russe collections that they already had and the American Ballet Theatre collections that they already had. But I looked at this mess and I thought, I can't possibly send them this. I don't even know what's in there. And there are perhaps not many people who would be able to identify what's in there. I'm one of the first suspects who might be able to recognize any of this stuff. And I felt this sort of rising sense of panic. And I thought, what am I going to do? There's just so much. I thought, one piece of paper at a time, deep breath, one piece of paper at a time. So I hung an old tablecloth over the window so that it wouldn't damage the light from California sunshine, wouldn't damage the images. And I sat on the floor and I thought, I'll make piles of Swan Lake, Les Sylphides. You know, it was easy to identify ballets because of the costumes. And then I thought, once I've done that, I will try and make them chronological. I will take the tiny pictures with frilly white edges. Those are the first ones. Then they get, you know, bigger and more technologically sophisticated. And I started making piles on the carpet around me. And as I sat there and the piles started to march in an orderly procession around the edge of the floor, I thought, I'm seeing a life in pictures. An extraordinarily well-documented life of a great artist who worked with great artists at a golden age of the art form. And it's all told in pictures, and no one's ever seen these before. And I know my mum wrote her autobiography, but no one really has seen a life told as vividly as these images. And I called my sister and I said, look, what do you think? I mean, maybe I could make this into a book for us, because I know that at the library you can still have access to the stuff. It's not like it's disappeared into a vault forever, but this could be a book for us and our children to see Mum. And she said, I think it's a fabulous idea. So I spoke to a friend of mine who knew a lot about photographs, and I said, where would I get the pictures scanned, you know, to make a book? And he gave me the name of someone in Pasadena who does high-res scans for books and galleries and art shows and things. And I looked at the 2,000 images, and I made a short list of 400. And the curator at the New York Public Library had said, well, you'd better do this before you send me anything, because once we get it, it's a bureaucratic nightmare. You know, you want to do it before. So I took the 400 shortlist over to Pasadena, and they were all scanned. And I ended up giving the library 1,800 photographs. It took me 5 months to catalog them in big binders, and all the correspondence, and they all went back into the packing cases, and all the boxes stood by the door ready to mail to the library. And I felt this wave of grief, because I thought, the past 5 months I've been with my mum again, and now she's leaving me. All the boxes are going to the library. But I thought, no, but I've got the book. I've got the book to do. And so the boxes disappeared, and I had the scans. I didn't have the images anymore, but I had the scans. And I thought, how will I tell this story? I will tell this life's journey. The piles that I had made, I thought, well, there's Russia. Before the revolution, my mother was born in St. Petersburg, and the earliest pictures show her and my grandparents. And then they escaped across the border into Romania. And so the story went on. I thought I'll put it in geographic terms, and then my chapters will be St. Petersburg, Romania, Paris, Monte Carlo, you know, America, London. I thought, that makes sense. Yes, that makes sense. And so I started. I sat at this tiny little computer that I have, because I'm not a techno person. With computers, I feel like I'm in an alarmingly large department store when all I want is a pair of socks. And I just really want to go to the sock counter, but I keep getting distracted by the perfume and the dresses. So with my computer, I just like to write. I don't want to know what else I can do with it. I just want to write. So I started. And I wrote a couple of chapters, and then I found someone who could help me turn it into a book. I hired someone who had been a dancer but was now a graphic designer and did books. And I said, it's very specific the way I need the layout, because the pictures can't just be put anywhere. They must be put in tandem with the story. So I don't think anyone would know how to do it unless I said. So I would cut out pictures of the pictures and paragraphs of the text, and I'd tape them onto sheets of paper, and then I'd give them to the book designer, and she would turn my paste-ups into layouts, and then I'd fiddle with it. I'd say, well, that needs to be a bit bigger, and that should go on the left, and this should go on the right, and we'd fill the page. And we worked in 2-page layouts. And so the book, the forward of the book is sort of telling how I came accidentally to find myself making this book. And then you start the story, and the story starts in St. Petersburg. And that's my granny Lydia, who was kind of a scary granny. She used to go to the hairdressers once a week and have her hair set and like sprayed solid, so it didn't move for the rest of the week. I used to call it her Kaiser Wilhelm helmet. So that's Granny and Mum, and Grandpa, who was a naval officer in the Imperial Navy in the Black Sea Fleet. He was flag officer to Admiral Kolchak, who after the revolution started was the supreme commander of the White Russian Army and Navy, and thus being his flag officer was a very dangerous job indeed. And during the revolution, the Navy was a particularly dangerous profession because the ship's officers were routinely getting murdered by the sailors, as a whole ship would go over to the Bolshevik side. And my great-grandfather, my granny's father, who was a general in the Imperial Guard, at a certain point Lenin decided all the epaulettes and signs of rank had to come off the uniforms, so everything was taken off. But his general's greatcoat was lined in red silk, and only generals had red linings. And he was on a train going to the country estate when 2 soldiers saw the inside of his coat and shot him in the face. And my grandmother had just had my mother, and they were waiting for her father to come from the station, and his body was carried in with half his face blown away. The house in St. Petersburg was commandeered. They were left 2 rooms of the house in the country and 1 cow. And my grandfather's best friend, that's the Tsar, and behind him is Sabline, my grandfather's best friend. The photograph was taken by my grandfather during a naval review where him and Sabline were rowing the Tsar from ship to ship for a battleship review. And my grandpa, who was a sort of Victorian amateur artist and photographer, took this picture. Sabline was engaged to my grandfather's sister, Vera, and he was murdered on the ship by having a ship's nail knocked through the top of his head while Vera was made to watch. After that, my grandparents decided that they had better leave because they were tipped off that they were next on the list. So they decided to run away to Romania, which was just across the border from where the Black Sea Fleet was stationed. It took them 3 days. They hid during the day in farmhouses where the farmers would let them hide in the barn and give them some bread and milk. And they would run during the day through the forest, during the night through the forest. And what they took with them was basically what they were standing up in when they decided to run. My grandfather carried my mother, and my grandmother took a leather bag with some family silver in it and his violin in a case. It's like if you have a fire, what do you take with you? She took his violin. So they ran they ran through the forest to the river, which was the border of Romania and Russia. And there was a smuggler with a rowboat who, for some jewelry, would row them across the river. And he told my grandparents, if the child makes a noise, I'm throwing her overboard, because she'll get us all shot. And so my grandmother had a lump of sugar in the pocket. And she put it in the baby's mouth and she held it there, hoping that that would distract the baby enough that she wouldn't make a noise. When they arrived in the village on the Romanian side, my grandfather went to the police station to turn themselves in as illegal immigrants with no papers. Because walking around in an Imperial Russian Navy uniform, he was bound to be spotted sooner or later, and he thought it was better to be upfront about it and to say, I have no papers, I'm a refugee, but I can't go back. If I go back, I'm going to be killed. And they let him stay because the police chief's wife had been married to a Russian naval officer. And when he was having lunch and telling her about this man who had shown up in the police station, he didn't know what to do. He was scared. He thought, maybe it's a spy. Maybe I'm going to get into trouble. I don't know what to do. And she said, well, I'll go back with you to the station, take a look at him. Maybe I'll know him. And she recognized him because her former husband had been in the same naval whatever as him. And she said, I know him. He is Michael Baronov. And he knew her. So her husband allowed him to stay. And they had the clothes they stood up in. They had nothing. They had some few pieces of silver. They found a one-room tenement in a factory block of apartments behind the factory. And my grandfather got a job in the factory. And they also got a job at the local cinema. During the silent movies, my granny played the piano and my grandfather played the violin. And that's how they got enough money to feed themselves. And there was no money for clothes or toys or books or anything like that. There was barely enough money to eat. And Granny said that she was hungry for 2 years, that they would give my mother food to eat until she said that she had had enough, and then whatever was left, they would split between the two of them. My grandmother, who was a terrible cook, who had never learned how to cook, said that she would make soup out of potato peelings. They'd feed the potato to my mother, and they would eat a sort of soup made with the peelings. And she said one day in the winter, a hand came through the door and took my grandfather's jacket off the hook. And he was in his shirt sleeves for the rest of the winter because there was no money to buy a coat. Somehow, out of all of this, my mother was taken to have ballet lessons. This is typical of my grandmother. They are starving, they are hungry, and yet she was so worried because my mother was turning into a ragamuffin who would climb trees and with slingshots aim pebbles at people as her idea of fun, and because they had no money for pens and pencils, would take a stick and draw pictures in the dirt. My grandmother decided that to civilize her, she was going to take ballet lessons. And also because my grandmother had wanted to take ballet lessons and had not been allowed to in St. Petersburg because ballet was something an upper-class person was a patron of, but certainly did not do themselves. With the social barriers down, there was no reason why her daughter couldn't have the dream that Granny hadn't been allowed to have herself. So she was carted off to another tenement where another white Russian refugee called Madame Majaiska gave ballet classes. The kitchen table was pushed up against the back of the one room, and my granny and Madame Majaiska sat on the bed, and they sang the music for the little girls to dance because there was no piano. And the girls hung on to the edge of the kitchen table, and they did their exercises. And my mother had no idea what she was doing. She'd never seen a ballet. She'd never seen a picture of a ballet. She knew that she liked being up a tree and throwing stones at people. What the hell was she doing holding onto a kitchen table, doing these odd movements? She had no conception. And she thought it was boring and stupid. So my grandmother goes home to Grandpa and she says she's got to see a ballet. She doesn't know what she's doing. I mean, you can imagine, he can barely feed them, and she's asking for ballet lessons. And now she says they've got to buy theatre tickets. And not just theatre tickets, but to get to Bucharest, you've got to buy train tickets as well. But Granny wasn't someone you argued with. So somehow he scraped the money together. He laid bricks, he cleaned offices at night, he took engraving on, and he would sit by the light of a candle all night engraving things, and then by day he'd go work in the factory. And he finally got the money to buy train tickets to Bucharest and tickets to the Bucharest ballet performance for the great Karsavina, who was coming through on tour and was going to perform. And when I was writing the book, I was thinking, I can't imagine what my mother's reaction would have been. A 7-year-old child, all she had known all her life was the tenement and the factory. And now she's taken to an opera house. I mean, to stand on the steps of this palace, and I think, well, all the people would have been pretty smartly dressed going in, and they would have been really shabby, and my grandmother wouldn't have liked that, but my mother wouldn't notice. To go inside and see crystal chandeliers and, gold woodwork and big staircases, and then to go in and sit on maybe a red velvet seat. Can you imagine? Child who knew nothing except shabby hand-me-down clothes and second-hand shoes, sit on a velvet seat, and then the lights go down and the music starts and a spotlight comes up on the stage and Karsavina appears, dressed as Columbine with the sparkles and the beautiful dress. And my mother said, "Oh my God, that's ballet?" She said to Granny, "That's ballet?" Granny's like, "Yes, that's ballet." She said, "But she's a fairy princess. How could I ever be a fairy like her?" And she got it. She absolutely got it. So now she goes back to Madame Mojaiska and the kitchen table, and she's doing her plie. She's got it in her head. That's what she is. She's going to be a fairy. And Madame Mojaiska says to Granny, "This child has something. She's really got something. You can't leave her with me. I'm going to ruin her." I mean, the generosity of a teacher to say that. So I can imagine poor Grandpa again. Granny comes home and she says, "Madame Mojaiska says she's going to ruin her. We've got to go to Paris." Olga Preobrazhenska, the great ballerina from St. Petersburg, is giving classes in a studio in Paris. Madame Mojaiska says that's where we've got to go. I think it took him a year to save the money to buy 3 third-class train tickets to Paris. And they gave up everything. I mean, they didn't have a lot, but they had made some kind of a life for themselves in Romania. And for a 7, 8-year-old child, they left everything and they got on a train and they went to Paris to give her a chance, to give her a chance to have a different life, to get out of the poverty and have a different life than the only life they were left with. And they find Olga Preobrazhenska's studio, which was a big room above the Olympia Music Hall, and they walk in, and she is in a terrible mood. Her husband left her that morning for one of her students, and she is royally pissed off. And she's shouting at everybody, and my mother is absolutely terrified and trying to hide behind the piano. And she's pushed out there to take a class and show what she can do. And at the end of it, Preobrazhenska, who was rather a small woman, tells my grandparents, "I'll take her. I don't know if she's going to be any good. If she's not any good, I'll tell you right away and you can stop wasting your time. And I can see that you have no money. I know you can't pay me. I'll take her anyway, and if she makes a go of it, she can pay me back then." And so she was taken on. I'm sure she wasn't the only charity case. that this saintly Preobrazhenska took on. And Preobrazhenska would organize for the little girls who were from these destitute families to do little tea dances for the rich, grand ladies in Paris at the weekends when they entertained their lady friends for a Saturday or Sunday tea. They would ask the school to send a little girl along to dance, to entertain the ladies. And so my mother was one of the girls who were sent out to dance at the tea dances. And she said it was really hard because we had to go on point on the thick carpets and to turn, and it was hard. But after the performance, I would be taken to the kitchen and the butler would give me a delicious slice of cake and cream and a glass of milk, and then surreptitiously pay my granny with some banknotes. Many years later, well, not that many years later, my mother was opening at the Paris Opera with the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo, and the Marquis de somebody or other gave a grand gala dinner after the opening night in his beautiful mansion, and there's champagne and oysters, and he dings his glass and he stands up to make a toast. I want to welcome Madame Baronova to my house. It's such an honor to have her here. And she says, oh, I've been here before. Only last time I ate in the kitchen. And she had danced for his mother. So she's taking class with Preobrazhenska, and Tamanova was in the same class, and two men show up one day. It's Colonel de Bazile, a white Russian cavalry officer who knew nothing about ballet, but was smart enough to figure out that he was a businessman who had artistic tendencies, and he could find people who did know things he didn't know, and he could make money at it. And he was with Mr. Balanchine, who was a Diaghilev dancer who was turning himself into a choreographer. And Colonel de Bazile had partnered up with René Blum, who was a gentleman from a rather grand Parisian family, whose brother Léon Blum was the first Jewish prime minister of France. René Blum was in charge of the Opera of Monte Carlo, and de Bazile had gone to him and said, we can partner up, we can start a ballet company. The Diaghilev company had been defunct for a couple of years. If you get me the theater space, I will find the dancers from the old Diaghilev and Pavlova companies, and I will find us a patron. You just fix it up so that the Société de Rabbin à la Mer in Monte Carlo will give us a home base and some seed money. So René Blum got them the rehearsal space, the theater space, the support of Monte Carlo, and de Bazile went off to Paris with Balanchine to find the dancers. And they had the basis of the old Pavlova and Diaghilev companies, but Balanchine said, I do not want to recreate those companies. I don't want to do the same thing. I want youth, I want speed, I want freshness, I want modernity, and I want to get young dancers, new dancers, and do it my way. And he picked, of the young dancers, these three very young girls, Tamara Tamanova, Tatiana Ryabushinska, and Irina Baronova. And Irina Baronova was 12. And her parents said, that's ridiculous. She's 12. She's at school. She can't join a ballet company. But de Bazile could talk anyone into anything. And so my granny and my mother found themselves in Monte Carlo. She was 12. I think Tanya was 15 and Tamanova was 13. And so started a rather dual existence, because when she was working with the company, when she was rehearsing, when she was taking class, when she was performing, she was a professional dancer in a professional company who was with adults, being treated like an adult, and who had a very specific place in the order of things. She had status, she had respect, she was a professional dancer. And then when she walked out of the theater, she was a little girl with pigtails who was absolutely ruled by her mother. And there she is, age 7. There is Karsavina. There is Preobrazhenska. Pretty good, huh? There is Balanchine and Colonel de Bazille. And there she is, age 12. Now, in this, La Concurrence, one of 2 new ballets that Balanchine made for them, La Concurrence, was set in a village, and it was the competition between 2 tailors. And the 2 tailors each had a shop, and there was a dressmaker's dummy outside one shop and grand clothes in the shop windows, and the village who walked through would try on new clothes and have pretensions and behave differently because of the clothes they were wearing, and then a tramp came in and no one wanted to do business with him because he was just a tramp, but then he returned as a successful, rich businessman, and both tailors were fighting to outfit him. And Balanchine came up with this idea. He must have seen the girls doing turns, fouettes, in the studio, of doing a sort of tour de force, almost an acrobatic act that had never been seen before. They were going to do 32 fouettes. And Tumanova was in the middle, and Tanya and my mum were on the outside, and they did 32 fouettes. This was a huge hit. The audiences had never seen anything like it before. And they started counting, 8, 9, 16, 17, 21, and then 32. Whoa! Everyone was thrilled. And Tanya and my mum got really sick of Mama Tumanova telling everybody how wonderful Tamara was. Oh, my Tamara is the best. Oh, my Tamara is a genius. Oh, my Tamara does everything so well. Oh, my Tamara. And finally, they came up with a naughty little plan that during the fouette, they would travel inwards. And they would squeeze Tamara, and Mama, who was always in the wings, would have hysterics, and then they would unsqueeze. And they would give Mama a little bit of a fright. And they thought, that sounds so fun. So the first time they did it, went very well. Mama's in the wings going, oh, my Tamara, they're going to kill my Tamara. The 2 of them were really pleased with themselves, and then they unsqueeze. And then on the second round, they go in, and disaster strikes. Tanya's outstretched foot clips the shopmaker's dummy. It falls over. It takes her with it. The 2 of them are rolling around on the floor. My mother is wearing a red wig, and it comes off her head except it's held by 1 pin. So every turn she does, the wig hits her in the face. And she's thinking, God is punishing me. God is punishing me for being so naughty. I'm going to get fired. And Mama Tumanova is having hysterics. And the audience is falling about laughing, just falling about. Well, de Bazille and Balanchine in the wings are like fuming, and then the moment the curtain comes down, they rush out on stage. What the hell do you think you are doing? I've never seen anything so disgraceful. I'm like, we just thought we wanted to play a trick on Mama Tumanova. And Balanchine said that his eyes were laughing, even though he was trying not to show it. And he said, that's very naughty, very, very naughty. And because he was amused, they didn't get fired. But Mum said with him in those days, he was tremendously good fun. In between rehearsals, when they took a break, he'd go over to the piano and he'd play boogie woogie, and all the kids would be dancing. She said it was one big party. It was like a fairy tale, a dream. After the summer break, they come back, and Balanchine has gone. He's asked for complete artistic control. De Bazille said no. He said, I'm out of here. I'm going to do my own company where I can do what I want. And Leonid Miassine came in. Now, rehearsing with Leonid Miassine was a different story. There was no boogie-woogie at the piano with him. It was serious business. He came in with books, And he laid them out on chairs, and he had a book where he notated his choreography. And my mother said that with him, the way he worked out the choreography is he would take the first few bars and he would try 5 different ideas. And then he'd move on to the next, and he'd try 5 different ideas. And then he'd move on to the next. And then he'd say, well, we'll do the 3rd idea from that, and the 4th idea from this, and the 1st idea. And they were like going mad trying to remember it all. But she said, you know, it was good for us because we realized we had to pay attention. It was serious business. It wasn't just all party. It was a job, and we had to work at it. And she got very interested in how he marked down the choreography. You know, what is it? How is he making these funny squiggles and things? And in the lunch hour, he would take her aside with their sandwiches, and the 2 of them would sit, and this great man would show her the choreography and how you notate it, and he would explain to her about the music and the ideas behind what he was doing. And she said, you know, I owe so much to the teachers, to the great teachers, who gave me their time, who gave me their respect to teach a child something because she was interested, because she wanted to know. Scuola di Ballo. And their first tour, one of the dancers, David Lichine, had an uncle in Paris who had an old bus company, and they rented, cut rate, a couple of old buses with the scenery and the costumes tied to the roof. And they did a tour of Germany, Switzerland, and Holland. You can see the sort of handmade sign in the back window, Russian ballet. And Myasine had an idea for the first truly modern ballet outside of Russia, the first truly modern ballet that did not involve stories, fairies, princesses, Arabian Nights, Greek gods. It was a symphonic ballet, movement and shape set to music, with the costumes and the scenery, modern art, color. It was all impressionistic. The dancers were cast, passion, you know, it was symbolic. And it was considered very avant-garde at the time. No one had ever seen a story that wasn't a story. And Myasine is sort of the inventor of truly modern dance in the West. My mother, who was 13, was cast as Passion, and she went around the rehearsal room saying to everyone, "What's Passion? What's Passion?" Can you imagine all the different answers she got? But I look at that body language and I think, well, she must have got the idea from somewhere, right? Then at the weekends, the dancers could go to the beach on a Sunday, and because they were young and healthy and they loved what they did, they never stopped dancing. Isn't that beautiful? It's just so beautiful. And that's my mother, like she was when she was a kid, drawing with a stick in the dirt. And then the next ballet was beach. Of course, you think, of course, Myasine got this wonderful idea, a homage to Monte Carlo, which was their home base, and it was a ballet about all the Monte Carlo types, the Riviera types, and my mother and Lichine as the bather and she was called the Rose White Maid, and Raoul Dufy did the scenery. And then they went to London. The first season of the company, they had been invited to London, and de Bazille said, no, we're not ready. We are not going to London and expose ourselves until we really know what we're doing. So in the second season, he said, I think we're ready. He accepted the invitation, and 2 of the great Diaghilev dancers joined the company at this point, Alexandra Danilova and Anton Dolin. And they went to London and they did the new Miassine ballet, Présage, which was a huge success. The London audience had not seen anything like it before, but they had heard from the Paris audience that there was this incredible avant-garde ballet that was scandalizing the classical music fans who said it's sacrilege. You know, a symphony is a work of art in its own right. It's sacrilege to put movement to a symphony and mess around with it. You should experience the music purely for itself. And it was sacrilege to the classical ballet people who wanted the princesses and the fairies and what is this, you know. But for some people, this was groundbreaking art, and it established Miassine as one of the foremost choreographers of the time. After the first performance, the girls were in their dressing room taking off the makeup, and de Basile brings a lady backstage, and she says, "Tanya, Irina, I want you to meet Tamara Kasavina." And my mother said, "Oh my God, you're my fairy princess. When I was 7, I saw you in Bucharest, and you are the person who made me love dance and want to be a dancer." And this signed photograph that Kasavina wrote to my mother, it says, "To dear Irina, with all my admiration for your great artistry and love for your dear self." And I thought, you know, what a tribute from the lady who was her idol. You know, what a magnificent thing to write to my mother. And then there was this event that happened that was an extraordinary opportunity for my mother. The little girls, the 3 girls, were allowed to have the leading roles in new ballets by the choreographers Balanchine and Miassine. But they were not considered ready for the great classics like Swan Lake. That was for Danilova. The little girls were not considered ready to be approaching those great roles. Swan Lake was on the program in London. It was a very big, important moment. And the day before, Danilova got sick. And de Basile decided, because my mother went to everyone else's rehearsal, and because my mother watched everyone else's performance from the wings, that she was the girl who was going to step in and take Danilova's part. Mama Tamanova was outraged. "It should be my Tamara should do it." So she was crying, and Tamara was crying, and Granny was crying, because Lishine, who was supposed to partner Danilova, said, "Well, I'm not going to dance with her in Swan Lake. I mean, all right to do it in Beach and that, but I'm not partnering her in Swan Lake. It's going to be a disaster. I'm not exposing myself like that." So that all this fuss was going on. And Dolin walks in and says, "What the hell's going on?" And they say, "Well, she's sick and she's going to replace her, but she wants her to, and he won't partner her." And Dolin said, "This is rubbish. I'll do it." So the great, great dancer of the time, he took this 13-year-old girl, he put her in the back of a taxi, he took her to his studio in Chelsea, he gave her a cup of milk, and he explained the ballet to her. He explained the role to her, and they started work in his studio, and they had the rest of that day and the next morning, and that night they opened in Swan Lake. And my mother wrote in her autobiography that the thing she will remember most about that night, the night when she became a star, was not just that they did it, or that they did it and the audience liked it, but that at the curtain call, Anton Dolin led her forward to the front of the stage, and in front of everybody, he kissed her hand. And he was saying, "I'm introducing you to your new star." Incredibly generous thing to do. And there they are. And there she was. And they were best friends and partners for the rest of their lives. I knew him as Uncle Pat. And he was an awful lot of fun. And then the next thing the company did was come to America. Now, America hadn't really seen a ballet since the last Diaghilev tour that had been a number of years before. And Sol Hurok, the great impresario, who was a Ukrainian emigre who came to New York and got into show business by putting on shows for the labor unions. That's how he started. And he eventually became the impresario for opera, for music, and for ballet. And de Bazile partnered up with him for an American tour for this new company. And apparently when their ship was coming into New York Harbor, Hurok arrived with lots of press reporters on little boats, and they were climbing on board the ship shouting, "Where's Mr. Diaghilev? Where's Mr. Diaghilev?" I said, "No, it's not Diaghilev. It's the Ballerinas de Monte Carlo. There's no more Diaghilev." And they were rehearsing in the St. James Theatre. They were rehearsing Sylphide, something. And the theatre manager says to de Bazile, "Well, it's pretty nice." And he says, "Well, what do you think?" He said, "Well, I've never seen a ballet before, but the girls are really pretty." I mean, can you imagine a theatre manager in New York who's never seen a ballet? I mean, people in America really did not know ballet. I mean, now it's really hard to conceive when so many cities in America have wonderful ballet companies, and pretty much every city has a ballet school, and every little girl has a tutu in her dress-up drawer. There was a time when nobody really knew what ballet was. So they open in New York, and de Bazile has rounded up every white Russian with a title he can find, the Grand Archduchess that, and the Prince of that. And they came with a program of 22 ballets. And Présage and the modern ballets did not go down well. The attendance wasn't so good. And an important critic said to de Bazile, "You got to put the old ones on. They're not ready for this. They don't know Les Présages. They don't want Les Présages. They want Petrushka, and they want Swan Lake. They want the ones they know." So the next week, they did a program of 6 ballets, which was Petrushka, and ticket sales soared. In fact, after the next 2 weeks, the theatre invoked the stop clause to prevent the company leaving on tour. So their first tour, these are all the ballerinas on board the ship. This is a very silly press photo, and Sol Hurok invented the sort of soundbite baby ballerinas that stuck to them for the rest of their lives. The 3 baby ballerinas. Petrushka. This was the first tour. They had their own train. They lived on the train. They had the train with the bunks on it, and the carriage where they ate, and the carriages that had the scenery and the costumes. They weren't in an old bus anymore. They had 6,000 costumes, a 50-piece orchestra, 2 conductors, the seamstresses and the wardrobe mistress. I mean, they had a train. And they had a second carriage with some of the scenery and costumes, because what they did is they had 2 programs when they went out on tour. And program 1 would be performing that night, and all the scenery and costumes for program 2 would be at the city ahead. So then the dancers' train would catch up to program 2, and the scenery and costumes for program 1 would go straight ahead and over to the next city. So they worked like that. Program 1, program 2, that's how they could do so many one-night stands. So they lived on this train for, 5 or 6 months at a time. This was before there were any unions. You see, no one would suggest to a dancer that they work like this anymore. You couldn't. And I realized, looking at this photograph, that Miassine is looking for the music for the first all-American ballet that was ever made. It was called Union Pacific. It was about the building of the railroad, and it was the first ballet that had an all-American story. There it is. Cowboys. Mum was the saloon girl. And then she met Jerry Sevastianov, another white Russian, who pitched up in New York. He was a distant cousin of Ryabushinska, and he started a big romance with Danilova that cooled slightly, but before it had cooled, de Bazile took a shine to him and said, "You're a smart young man, why don't you come along and be my personal secretary and help me manage the business of ballet?" And so he joined the company, and after the romance with Danilova cooled, he took my mother out for an ice cream. And she said, "How old are you?" And it turned out he was 15 years older than her, and she thought that was really cool. And when she repeated it to her parents, they said, "You're not allowed to talk to him again." Very bad move. Because then he was instantly the most attractive man in the world to her. And they were living on a train. Can you imagine not being allowed to talk to someone when you're living on a train? That was the second tour. Kind of unimaginable, isn't it? They all bought themselves fur coats, and they arrived in Los Angeles, Clark Gable, Myrna Loy, Charlie Chaplin, all the movie stars. And Myasine traveled with his car and his trailer. Instead of sleeping on the train, he liked to travel with his wife and his car and his trailer. And in Los Angeles, Marlene Dietrich became fascinated by him, and she sat on a wooden chair in the wings and watched every single performance. And when the company moved on to Santa Barbara, she went with him in his trailer. And then, it's sort of unimaginable, isn't it? And then on one of the tours, my mother had a break between rehearsal and performance, and she went round the corner to a coffee shop, hoping that Jerry would walk into the coffee shop. And she sat there for 2 hours waiting, and he didn't come. But when she got back to the theatre, Granny said, "Where have you been?" And she said, "Oh, I was rehearsing." And Granny smacked her. And Granny always wore a big cocktail ring with a big amethyst in it, and it clipped her eye, and she had a huge shiner. And there was a lot of chit-chat that night because a lot of makeup was required to cover up this black eye. And that night, at 1:30 in the morning, de Bazile at Mum's hotel door, she slept with the interconnecting door open to her parents' rooms. It was like, shh. He said, "Show me your face." He said, "I heard about this. What happened?" She said, "I slipped and fell on the bathroom." He said, "Get a good night's sleep, and tomorrow you'll tell me the truth." The next day, she told him that Granny had hit her because she had lied about wanting to see Jerry, and he said, "Do you like him?" She said, "Yes." "Do you love him?" She's 16. She says, "Yes." She says, "Do you want to marry him?" She says, "Yes." He says, "Right, we'll make a plan, we'll let you know." And de Bazile and Hurok come up with a plan. They're protecting their ballerina. And they tell it to the road manager, who relays it to my mother. When we get to Cincinnati, you are going to be in the first half of the program. You will tell your parents that you're going to watch the second half from the auditorium. Go out the back door. There'll be a taxi waiting. Jerry will be in it. You'll go to the airport. You'll fly to the next city. By the time they catch up with you, you'll be married. My mum said, the only thing she took with her that night in her purse was 6 rollers for her hair. So it all happens as planned. She tells her parents she's going to watch the rest of the program from the auditorium. She gets in the taxi. Jerry's waiting. They fly to the next city, and he drives her across the state line into Kentucky, where the legal age to get married is not 18, it's 17. Well, when I was in the New York Public Library doing research for the book, I'm looking at the travel dates, because I found the tour dates in the road manager's notebooks, all written out in ink. No one's ever seen these tours written out like that before. And I looked at the dates of the things, and I saw when they were in that, and when they went to Cincinnati, and then they drove across the state line into Kentucky, and I think, wait a minute, that's 21 days before Mum's birthday. She wasn't 17, she was still 16. So she wasn't really legally married at all. She wouldn't have known that, but Jerry would have. And so by the time her parents caught up with them, she was married. I can imagine my granny, I can imagine what that must have been like. And there was a standoff with the parents and Jerry one night. It was really a show of power. One of the dancers had a tummy ache and couldn't dance in the last ballet on the program, and it was a part that my mother had danced before she became one of their prima ballerinas. And Jerry rushed to her dressing room and said, "Could you please dance that part, because you used to dance it, you know it, and she can't do it." And my grandmother said, "Absolutely not, she's not dancing that. She's, leading dancer now. She's not going to be dancing that part." And Jerry says, I'm begging you. We don't have anyone who knows the part. Could you put on the costume and dance it?" Granny says, "Absolutely not. She's not dancing that. No, she's the leading ballerina. She's not going to dance it." And my mother finally says, "Bring me the costume." Granny leaves the dressing room. By the time my mother gets to the hotel, her parents are walking out with their suitcases. And she didn't see them for a year. They went to New York, she didn't know where they were. They refused to communicate with her. And it wasn't until they came back for the last tour, there was someone waiting on the port side, friend of her parents, to say, "Your father's had a heart attack. They don't know I'm telling you this, but I have their address here, here it is. If you want, go see them." And she rushed to see them, and that was the rapprochement. And a sort of truce was called between Jerry and her parents. And that was how the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo brought ballet to the United States. That was the 4th tour, the 5th tour. You can see how she's now become a sort of an adult ballerina. So I know that we're sort of out of time here, but I want to leap ahead to the end of the story. When I was going through the boxes, as well as the photographs and the correspondence, I found a little silk pouch. And I'd never seen it before. And I managed to get the zip open with difficulty at the top. And inside were 2 pink satin toe shoes. And written in my mother's handwriting was Irina Baronova in the lining of one, and in the other was my last performance. And I just sat on the floor and sobbed. And while I was writing this book, I thought I'd really love to go to St. Petersburg. All these years when Mum was alive, we kept saying, we're going to go to St. Petersburg together. We're going to do a roots thing. We're going to go back and find the family house. And we never did. So with my husband and my 2 children, we actually went to St. Petersburg 2 years ago. And I had listened to a tape that my brother had made while he interviewed Granny. And she said in the tape, it's funny the things you remember. I remember the telephone number of our house and the address, and she says the address. And I looked at the address, and I could only write it down phonetically, but when I looked at the street map of St. Petersburg, I couldn't find the street. We had a guide and a driver, and I said to the driver, maybe you could help, because I've got this address, but I can't find the street. And he said, oh, well, the street names changed after the revolution. They all named them Lenin or something, but there's a church with that name and a bridge with that name. So at that crossroads, that street has to be either the one that went this way or the one that went that way. So with the number of the house, we drove up and down the streets looking for a house number. First street, there wasn't a number that coincided. The second street, there was the house. It was boarded up. No one was in it, but it was the house. And we found the school that she used to walk to 2 blocks away. And I had called the Vaganova Academy, the great ballet academy that had trained all the dancers you've heard of, Fokin, Karsavina, Pavlova, Nijinsky, Nureyev, Baryshnikov, I mean, all of them. Only Mersin, who were trained in Moscow, but everyone else. And when I Googled them online, I saw they had a museum, beautiful little ballet museum. And one of the pictures of the museum showed a glass case with a starburst of pink toe shoes. And I fired off an email. It says contact us. So I fired off an email to the director of the academy saying, I have Baronova's toe shoes. Would you like them? Yes! Came back immediately. Yes! So I took the toe shoes with me to St. Petersburg, and we were there on a Sunday, and they opened the museum for us. And my husband took this picture of me giving the toe shoes to the director of the academy and the museum. And I thought, well, Irina Baronova never got to dance in St. Petersburg, but her toe shoes are there.
We have a little bit of time left for two questions. We have a little bit of time left for two quick questions. So if anybody has any questions. No? Anybody? Oh, all right.
I did study ballet. I was sent to a ballet school. It was the gift my mother could give as a Russian ballerina in the English countryside, where she didn't play golf and she didn't drink gin. She could give us the gift of ballet, and we weren't really sure that we wanted it. And my sister and I were sent to a ballet school where, because we were Baronova's daughters, we disappointed everybody. 2 hours a day, 5 days a week for 8 years. Yeah. Jerry is not my father. They were married for 8 years, by which time American Ballet Theatre was then Ballet Theatre, and my mother was one of the 2 founding ballerinas of American Ballet Theatre, her and Alicia Markova with Anton Dolin. And because Jerry was embarrassed that he was 15 years older than my mother, when they were on tour in Australia, he had a Yugoslavian passport. He took it to the consulate because it needed renewing, and he said, there's been this little mistake. You know, because I'm a refugee and things were all mixed up after the revolution, I'm not really that old. So they were very obliging. They said, no problem, we'll change. So on his new passport, they knocked a few years off his age. Now we're in America, Second World War. America joins the war, call-up papers. He's the director of ballet theatre, right? He gets the call-up papers. So he goes along to the recruiting office and he says, there's been this little mistake. And the sergeant isn't as obliging as the Yugoslavian consulate in Sydney. He says, well, I'll give you 2 choices because you lied on your immigration papers. Either you join the army or you go to jail. So he joined the army. And he disappeared for a couple of years, and the marriage sort of didn't last after that. My mother met my father, who was very English because she was making a movie in England, and he owned the biggest theatrical agency in London. And he took her out to dinner, and 10 days later he proposed. And then when I was 17, my father was killed in a car crash, and Jerry came back. And Jerry said, I hear what happened. What can I do? Can I help? And, you know, he loved her his whole life. And they got back together again. If we had time, I could tell you his story.
Oh.
I don't. What I do speak is there was a Russian nursery rhyme that Granny used to sing to us every morning when she woke us up to go to school. So I didn't like it because I associated it with going to school. And it's a little song, like a sort of Mother Goose rhyme, about a sparrow who wets his feathers in a puddle. While I was taking pictures of Granny's house in St. Petersburg, which was on the Fontanka Canal, the little lady guide says to me, "Do you know about Chizhik Pizhik?" I haven't heard these words for like 50 years. And I said, "Chizhik Pizhik, j'étais bien la Fontanka." She says, "Yeah, that." I say, why do you ask? And she says, "Well, because Chizhik Pizhik, the statue of Chizhik Pizhik, a little bronze bird, is set in the parapet of the canal outside this house." I thought, well, that confirms it. Of course it's Granny's house. That's why she sang that song. And I went and looked, and there was this little bronze bird.
You're a marvelous storyteller.
Thank you.